Hi everyone, welcome to our seminar. So this is a seminar that's generally sponsored by the U.S. Dialogue on Collaboration. And also this is a seminar co-organized by me. I'm an assistant professor at the business school. My name is Li Zhiliu, and also by Professor Neng Lin from the Public Policy School. So today is our great pleasure to have Professor Meg Rithmire to join us and discuss her very recent book, which is an awesome book based on three-country comparison. So there are a lot of great things about Meg that I want to share with you. So I actually have this cheat sheet on my phone to ensure that I don't miss anything important. So Meg Rithmire is a James Robinson Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. She's also the first woman to earn tenure in her group with the research as primary concentration. This is an incredible achievement. If you know anything about the tenure criteria at Harvard, you would know, first, it's almost impossible to get tenure there. And second, you have to be among the best in your generation within your field. So this is amazing. Meg's research focuses on the comparative political economy of development with a focus on China and Asia. She has published widely, and her 3 books, I think, jointly make very important contribution to our understanding about Chinese political economy and political economy in general. Her first book is on China's land reform, and the second book is on the increasing control by the Communist Party over the Chinese economy, or in her terms, the party-state capitalism. Today, she's going to present her third book, The Precarious Ties, which is a remarkable project. It's a truly comparative work, rarely seen in comparative politics, actually, drawing upon insights from 3 countries, including China. While I can go on and on about Meg's research, I want to talk about something that's not on her CV. For me, she actually won the award for writing the best book dedication. When you write a book, you usually dedicate the book to someone or someone important in your career or in your life. She actually dedicated this book to the daycare where her kids stayed during the pandemic. And said her work is only possible because of these people's help, right? Like the teachers of the daycare. So this dedication reminds us, behind this very important book, there's an untold story about struggles about raising 2 young kids during the pandemic, and a very inspiring message to all of us about the resilience that lie behind her great achievement. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Litra. I'm just going to put this here because I think it'll be fine. Gosh, that was like the nicest introductions anyone's ever made. Meanwhile, my slides up here say February. I did update them, but I did not update that one, so I apologize for that. And yes, it's just what every early childhood educator wants, is a book about corruption in Asia. So, but thank you for that very generous introduction. I've had such a lovely time here over the last couple of days. I always love coming to Georgetown, but getting to meet PhD students and meet a whole lot of scholars who work on China is really special. Georgetown has a really lucky place to have the concentration of specialization that you have here. Okay, so thanks for eating lunch and listening to me talk about this book. At the end of the talk, I'll say a few more things, updates, and some things about how we should think about China moving forward. But thank you, Liz, for the invitation. So the theoretical motivation for the book, which is maybe less interesting than the empirical motivation, is really the question, how do authoritarian regimes discipline business? So in almost every authoritarian regime in the world, right, there is some mix of markets and state intervention, and the question of basically you have these authoritarian regimes that want to generate economic development, but need the disconnected actors in the private sector to undertake certain risks while they do that, but not so risky that it ends up being destabilizing for the authoritarian regime itself. And so there's a kind of long history of understanding the political role of business elites in societies, and 2 of which the characterizations you see here. So the first is Barrington Moore who was not talking prescriptively. He was describing the role that the bourgeoisie played in development, particularly in Northern Europe and the UK. And he said, no bourgeoisie, no democracy. So the expectation is that as soon as people get wealthy, they want to demand political inclusion and respect for their property rights, and therefore they agitate for political rights as well. And the second is what we more familiarly encounter over the last generation, which is the idea that it's actually crony capitalism and business elites in authoritarian regimes that are assisting with what we call authoritarian resilience, so upholding crony leaders. And so they're more likely to be sources of authoritarian durability than they are to be sources of democratization. But we see all kinds of things empirically, and let me just, that are kind of different from that. So let me introduce the empirical context and then the puzzles. And so the book itself focuses on 3 authoritarian regimes. So China under the CCP, I will call it the CCP from 1949 to the present. Indonesia's New Order under Suharto from the mid-1960s through 1998 when the regime dissolved. And Malaysia under the Barisan Nasional, so from 1957-58 all the way through 2018 when the UMNO lost elections for the first time in Malaysia's history. And these 3 regimes, which are very different in obvious ways, generate a number of interesting puzzles. So the first, I'll start here. Just in general, we have basically, Mao Zedong leading a communist revolution, yet Asia, right, and China really is home to the world's largest concentration of billionaires. And so how does that really work? But also you have, right, Malaysia, this regime, which was founded on a staunch commitment to anti-communism, which over the last 60 years has presided over the most serious, forceful redistribution of wealth that's on an ethnic basis in Malaysia, but a very serious redistribution of wealth over the long term. In addition to that, right, the puzzle, so there was and I'm going to talk a little bit about this emergency, the 1947 through 1957-58 period, in which British police forces, or really the British military, assisted the Malaysian military in fighting against a communist insurgency. And then in 1969, you have elections that are basically lost, but nonetheless huge electoral gains by Chinese ethnic parties, which somehow ironically result in coercive redistribution that targets the Chinese community. So they do better in elections, but that translates into more punitive policies for them. And how has that been sustained over a 60-year period in that particular country? And then we have Indonesia, right? So up here you see General Suharto. Down here is Suharto holding his best friend, sometimes called this beautiful friendship between Sudono Salim, one of the largest business magnates in Indonesia, one of the richest men in the world at the time, who were beautiful friends. And Sudono Salim and a lot of people like him were among the first to abandon Suharto and move their assets overseas when Suharto got a little bit weak in the Asian financial crisis, and so it unravels very quickly. And here you have you have Suharto signing over with Michel Camdessus and the IMF, basically saying these are the commitments I'm making to breaking up these monopolies that are controlled by my friends and my family. And I had this wonderful moment where during field research, someone said, well, once I saw him doing that and selling out his son, I realized if he's going to sell out his son, he's going to sell out me. And so I pulled everything out of Indonesia at that point. And so this idea that the regime was built on this extremely strong collaboration between business and the state that unraveled very quickly over the course of a few months in Indonesia was very interesting to me. But my heart is really in China for reasons that I'll explain. So the puzzles are, why do you have these regimes that are founded on these alliances between autocrats and capitalists, and yet over time you witness one side betraying the other really rapidly with dramatic consequences? The regime with the most punitive history towards business, which is indeed the PRC under the CCP, has outperformed the others in terms of both economic growth and political stability. And then you have this category of cronyism that seems to describe a lot of places, but it seems static in a way in saying it supports authoritarian resilience and explains none of the change and drama and how we get different kinds of outcomes in these different kinds of regimes with stagnation, political stability, fiscal crisis, financial crisis, et cetera. So the argument that I make is that there are some concepts that we do less than we think that they do, and those are indeed cronyism and co-optation. So cronyism, it's like we think we know what it is, but once you think about it a little bit more, it's not that interesting of a concept. Yes, there's cronyism everywhere, but why are some cronies end up betraying one another and others don't. So my favorite example is Roman Abramovich and Mikhail Khodorkovsky, for those of you who know the Russian context. So Khodorkovsky, Abramovich for a while was owning a Chelsea football club and driving his yacht around the Mediterranean, while Khodorkovsky was a seamstress's apprentice and somewhere in Siberia. And why is it that you have, those elite relationships fraying and some stay strong? The other example is Miles Kwok, or Guo Wengui, who is very familiar likely to most people, who was a huge supporter of the cronies in Beijing and got a lot of contracts and money from his relationship with political elites in China, until suddenly he's living in a penthouse in New York City and recording all kinds of videos about who's corrupt and who's not corrupt. And so this betrayal happens rapidly, and we don't tend to understand those dynamics. And so we just call them crony, and it doesn't explain very much. Co-optation makes me even less happy as a person who talks a lot with business people. So the understanding is that the business sector has been co-opted by, their interests being aligned with the regime. Well, what happens when their interests are no longer aligned? Do we think that it's going to look like loyalty and that they've somehow been suddenly neutralized? And that just because their interests are brought into the regime doesn't mean that's a stable relationship, or that neither side is taking actions to hedge against eventualities that may in fact occur, and those actions end up being really consequential. And so here's just my little depiction of cronies vary, right? So here you have, I don't like calling Li Yifei a crony because I think she's a serious businesswoman, but the rest of them are definitely cronies, right? So you have Li Yifei, who runs the Man Group, a hedge fund manager in Shanghai, one of the most famous business people in Shanghai. She was detained during the 2015 stock market crisis. Her husband said, I don't know where she is, I think she's been detained. And then she said, no, I was just meditating on a mountain. We know that she was probably detained by Chinese regulatory authorities who were trying to get her to explain what was actually happening in stock markets at the time, but she goes on to have a nice business career and be fine. Guo Guangchang here on the bottom right, who's the chairman of Fosun. He's typically called China's Warren Buffett. He's been detained several times between 2015 and the present, and he's subject to what I call in the book catch and release, where he's detained, never charged. These two men, not exactly, right? So as I said, Guo Wengui has fled from China, singing like a bird in New York. Actually, I think he's now in jail in the United States for crimes here, but that's a whole other story I have no interest in. And Xiao Jianhua, who's the most interesting to me, right? Who was the banker to the political elite in China, who actually fled China in 2014. He fled Beijing and was in Hong Kong for a period of time until the CCP, I use the word kidnapped, that's a little bit difficult. I don't want to get into whether the CCP has jurisdiction in Hong Kong at that time, but I will just say he was taken out of the Four Seasons where he resided and brought back to Beijing, but it was 5 years before they announced charges and actually convicted him. And the timeline of all of this is very interesting for reasons I try to explain in the book and we'll hopefully get to today. The other thing about co-optation is here. So I have to teach balance of payments, and so I think it serves everyone to learn how to read a country's external accounts. But the most interesting thing here is capital flight and errors and omissions. For those of you who know what any of those things mean, errors and omissions just means money that's leaving China that's not recorded, right? Could be cash in suitcases, could be transfer payments, could be gambling in Macau or gambling in Macau, all kinds of things, right? And capital flight is just a more aggregate measure of those things plus other things. So here's the period of, and the yellow line is outward direct investment, right? So this looks negative, but it means it's capital flowing out of China. So what's happening is this is the period of time where everyone's writing books about, is China buying the world? China's going out, China's buying all of Africa and Latin America. And actually for almost every year, the money leaving China illegally was more or equal to the official foreign direct investment going outside of China. Which tells you that even if the business elite seemed to be co-opted and not marching in the streets asking for democracy, they were doing something that showed that they didn't trust their status in the regime, and those some things have enormous consequences, is basically what the book argues. Another example, this is one of my favorites, the China Minsheng Investment Group, Zhongmentou, which was established by Li Keqiang in 2013 with the imprimatur. So most of you who know China, right, if you have the 中国 at the beginning of a company's name, it implies that it's a state-owned company or gives it the imprimatur of the state. And it was established under a directive of the State Council saying what we really want is a private consortium to invest in industrial upgrading in China. We need private allocation of capital, and so they asked all of these shareholders to come together and put up their own money to become the JP Morgan of China. And they did that, and within about 3 years, the thing was taken into state receivership and 300 billion renminbi of debt, right? Why? Because almost all of those shareholders end up pledging their shares, engaging in self-dealing, absconding with some of the money, their own money, actually. And that's what's so interesting to me, is the looting of people's own firms during this period. And I'll talk a lot about that a little bit more. But we understand why they might be nationalized. We understand why state business people, right, people who are using state money might gamble it away or be corrupt or, you know, or gamble with resources in a way that ends up in bankruptcy. But we don't quite understand why private sector elites would do that. It sort of inverts the whole logic of what the private sector is supposed to do in any country, yet we find it in different kinds of regime, this looting behavior, which I'm going to focus on quite a bit. And a lot of this, right, you see on great display with dramatic consequences for politics in China. So on the top, you have some pictures from the peer-to-peer lending platform protests in 2018. This one's from 2019 in Shanghai. The ones in 2018 in Beijing were even more serious. And then here, you know, a story we've all been following, the breach of Evergrande's headquarters in 2021, where you have Evergrande, this interesting company that was the most indebted company in the world in 2020 when it gave Harvard University $100 million in a philanthropic gift to study the pandemic, right? And so why are companies that are so indebted continuing, Xu Jiayin, who's the chairman of Evergrande Group, buying football clubs all over Europe at the same time, absconding with his own resources? He's now been charged and detained you know, for a variety of reasons, right? But why would a company that has already indebted itself so much engage in this type of behavior is really confusing from the perspective of the kind of business that Stephen and Lisa and I try to teach, which is don't do that. So anyway, and you have these examples in Indonesia, which I will get to later. So what the book does is try to add more nuance to the discussion of cronyism and co-optation by looking at different kinds of state-business relationships in the view of the pathologies that they create, right? So methodologically, you know, this is not a talk about causal inference, and I don't do a lot of causal inference in the book, but methodologically what I'm trying to do is not just conceptualize different modes, but show how they might manifest in observable behaviors that allows us to distinguish between one type of state-business relations and another. And the key here, and there's a 2x2, and I'll show the 2x2, as all political scientists love to do, but the key things are mutual alignment and mutual endangerment. And mutual endangerment, I really think, is the conceptual innovation of the book. But mutual alignment is that, you know, you have basically, by definition, authoritarian regimes rarely have rule of law that is impartially executed by a judiciary, where the property rights are unconditionally protected by the rule of law. That's kind of how authoritarian regimes work. But nonetheless, sometimes they have institutions or informal practices that are organized to serve the productive interests of business and sometimes society. I call it mutualistic, kind of in biological terms, because society does get some economic development, but there are pathologies. And the pathologies are what Eva Bellin has called the developmental paradox of the authoritarian state, which is, you know, you want private sector elites to do all these things, and so you give them subsidies, you give them credits, you give them informal institutions that allow them to do that. But then if you want to shift to a different mode of development, so break out of the middle income trap and do something else, it's hard to break up those vested interests. And so you get both kind of, you get these stuck economic elites that prevent economic advancement. So she calls it this developmental paradox. The more resources you give to development, the more stalled you are at a later stage. What I was really interested in is mutual endangerment, which is economic and political elites are mutually entwined in these corrupt dealings, and they're invested in perpetuating each other's dominance because they fear mutual losses, right? So everyone knows I bribe a guy in order to get a license to import something that I need to import. The pattern that I observe in mutual endangerment is very different from that. In fact, it's not clear that the business elites are getting any real resources from the political elites. What they're doing is bringing them into a coalition to protect themselves from being prosecuted or persecuted later down the line. I argue that it's competitive with society in biological terms because elites are diverting and consuming social resources, and the pathology is that it's inherently unstable, for reasons I hope to explain when I talk about the manifestations of it. I said that there would be a 2x2. Here's my 2x2. And what determines, of course, why you get one type of state-business relations over another is, I argue, the trust and the presence of trust between political elites and business elites, and then second, the degree of financial control. And I'm mostly interested actually in financial control, so I'll talk a little bit about trust today. And as I talk about trust, it's important to emphasize, by trust, I don't mean love. I don't mean that they love each other and are loyal under all circumstances. What I mean is basically expectations for returned cooperation. If I do something, you will return my cooperation by cooperating with me, rather than expecting betrayal. Expecting betrayal is distrust, and I argue it has pretty profound consequences. So you can see here, basically, how that works out in terms of the cases. And so there's instability. So I argue that Malaysia was a case of mutual alignment. But when they did liberalize the financial sector in the 80s and 90s, they moved to kind of competitive clientelism in a certain way, where you do find that's a pretty familiar pattern for those of us who look at the literature in state-business relations. It's patron-client relations. It's, I have these business leaders who support me politically, and I give them resources. We're used to that kind of thing, so it's not a huge innovation, but it does, I think, obtain in that particular case. And the cases of mutual endangerment are China, really, in the 21st century, and Indonesia from the moments of financial liberalization in the 1980s all the way through the financial crisis. Okay. Take a sip of water. So the book has too many chapters, probably. I understand that Professor Looney assigned it, and I said I stand in solidarity with her students who said it was too long. I myself was a little undisciplined in chapter 5, so I apologize. But the first book is more historical, and it looks at archival resources and memoirs on the regime formation period in all three countries. What's very interesting, people don't often compare China to Southeast Asia. They usually compare China to Russia for reasons that are obvious, or China to India for reasons of size. But what's really interesting about China and Southeast Asia is that these three regimes, they're very different, right? China is a communist party state. Indonesia was maybe a bureaucratic military regime and then kind of a personalistic, sultanistic regime. They change over time. Malaysia is competitive authoritarian, right, but with elections that have consequences. But all three societies actually have a similar moment of national liberation, although not similar circumstances, and they all experience cataclysmic grassroots violence in the late 1960s. And that ends up, and they influence each other in ways that are really, I found really interesting. So the second chapter is more historical and talks about that formation of trust or distrust during the regime formation period, and I'm looking at the political status of the pre-war domestic capitalist class, the role of the Japanese occupation, that immediate post-war conflict in all societies, the capitalists and the new regimes, and then this period of cataclysmic violence. And I'm just going to talk about these two periods very briefly as I go through the cases before I get to focus mostly on China. So this puzzle about Malaysia, which is how do you get a staunchly anti-communist regime whose signature policy thing is extreme redistribution over the course of a 60-year period, and how did they achieve that without significant challenges from the Chinese community, which in Malaysia, unlike Indonesia, where the ethnically Chinese community is estimated between 2% and 5%, although it's politically sensitive, and so we don't measure it in a lot of ways. In Malaysia, it's more like a third. And so the argument I make is that this history of pre-World War II, pre-independence, independence, and post-independence violence, basically what you have is that there's a difference between the ethnically Chinese elites in Malaysia and the Chinese non-elites, right, who definitely don't trust the regime and have been victims of this punitive campaign for redistribution. And why that is that there's a fear of ethnic conflict and a threat of national integrity, right, that was very serious at the time. I take seriously that the communist insurgency in Malaysia was communist. So a lot of people see it just as ethnic conflict, but the archival record doesn't hold up to that. And in fact, most scholars of Malaysia haven't looked at local Chinese sources and variation within the Chinese community in Malaysia, which is what I do. And that there's also this regional history, this auspicious timing vis-a-vis events in mainland China. So at the moment where there is this cataclysmic violence following the 1969 elections, many Chinese, even elite Chinese in Malaysia, couldn't quote unquote return whether they'd ever been to China or not. They didn't have China, the mainland, as a destination to which to return because China was in the throes of the Cultural Revolution, in which was punishing their family members. And so that's part of the explanation. There's also this extensive fragmentation of the non-elite Chinese population in different kind of both religious organizations, different business associations, different political parties, whereas the elite Chinese form and cohere behind the Malaysian Chinese Association, the MCA, which joins the Barisan Nasional coalition and basically agrees to political hegemony on Malay terms as a condition of continuing to be able to do business, and accepts many of these limitations because they fear the alternative. And so this crucible of violence and of threats to national integrity allowed these elites to expect each other's cooperation during a critical time period, which is sustained over the following decades. And so just some interesting quotes about like when the MCA basically succeeds, and it has, in my view, a lot to do with the start of the emergency as well as the establishment of the People's Republic and the foreclosure of that alternative route of leaving Malaysia and establishing themselves elsewhere. So I'm not going to go through all of this, actually. But there is this hyper embrace of national loyalty, or at least appearing to support Malaysian consociationalism on essentially Malaysian terms, or Malay terms rather. And so Bumiputras of Chinese origin should show that they're as loyal to this country as any other Bumiputras, right? And part of it is because they see what's happening in Indonesia, they see what's happening in mainland China, and they decide to trust those elites to protect them in exchange for that, which they really do. Okay, so I'm going to go through this. So Indonesia is a different situation, because we assume, right, a lot of the literature on Indonesia has been about the Chinese business elite in Indonesia and how close they were with Suharto. But you can be close without trust. In fact, sometimes you're close because of distrust. And so the story in Indonesia is quite different. Why do you have these Chinese business elites attaching themselves to Suharto, and why does that unravel so quickly? There's a kind of history of it, which I won't go through here. The mass violence in Indonesia took the shape of an anti-communist purge, which ended up being just a general purge, which ended up being targeted also at Chinese in a lot of different ways, as well as pre-Bumi Indonesians that had grievances with all sorts, all sorts of people within society had grievances. And so it's cataclysmic violence sometimes is inexplicable based on social terms. It's sometimes people killing their neighbor because they didn't like them before, and it's an excuse to do that. But anyway, it's a cataclysmic moment. And what we actually find is that the exchange, right, in this interesting way, in the classic way in which it's explained, is that Suharto wanted business elites to be able, he was also staunchly anti-communist, wanted to embrace the capitalist West, and wanted business elites to invest in Indonesia and help Indonesia grow and do the things that he was not able to do. And actually empowering these Chinese business people, because they were, the political route to power for those people was foreclosed. So it was a clear division of labor, right? You do the economic stuff, I'll do the political stuff, you can't challenge me. But the other element to that I think is underappreciated in a lot of the literature is that Suharto himself, both during the 1965-1966 period of purging communists, and also in constant pogroms and riots throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s, stoked ethnic violence in order to remind the Chinese community that they were only safe at the pleasure of him and his military, right? So it's an interesting closeness because they reciprocally depend on one another, but on terms where they fundamentally don't necessarily expect each other's cooperation and are therefore hedging their behaviors and trying all the time to make themselves safe in the expectation of this distrust. And I argue that this has profound consequences for how these businesses behaved, actually, in Indonesia over the long term. Okay, so I'm gonna skip the riot stuff. So let me get to China, which most people are most interested in, although I just think Southeast Asia is fascinating and underappreciated by social scientists, and I wouldn't have been able to understand China if it weren't for understanding Southeast Asia. So these are two of the most profound questions that have motivated a generation of research in political science in China and political economy, which is how is the CCP with formally bad institutions sustained growth for 3 decades, maybe 4, but let's say 3, and why has business not agitated for capitalist institutions? So most people, there are lots of answers to the first question. I'm going to give you some that are not necessarily original, but integrate some of that. And the second question has been answered by a lot of really smart people, including, one of my co-authors, Kelly Tai, who's written a couple of different books basically on this, thinking about, well, they don't identify as a class and they don't prefer democracy. And I love Kelly, but I think that's the wrong question to ask. Do you see yourselves as a class and do you prefer democracy? And part of what the book is about is that business elites can cause political instability and change without intending to create democracy and democratization. They have a disruptive power that we should pay attention to. But in any case, these are the questions, and let me go through a little bit how I tell the story in the book so that I can show what I'm adding. So the argument that I make is that the answer to the first two questions really is that there was an informal mutual alignment between business and the state in China that made up for the poor institutions for a long period of time. This is not necessarily original. A lot of people have made this argument, right? Low levels of corruption has made it work. Chiang Kai-shek calls it special deals, right? So there's all kinds of ways of thinking about this, and so that's not entirely original. And the argument is that as long as business felt like it had secure access to resources, it would invest appropriately. So you have two scholars here who work a lot on why the private sector does what it does, right? We had this great conversation about it last night. And where it's like, I know there are some maybe economists in the room. I love economists, God bless you. But they'll say, oh, there's not perfect property rights institutions. People won't invest. People don't need perfection. They need a marginal enough incentive to know that they're going to do okay. And so that's what drove a lot of this activity over a long period of time. But also, and this is where the real Chinese politics come in, is that insecure business, like all Chinese citizens, have been quite adept at adapting and transforming to uncertain politics in the particular contours of the Chinese Communist Party's run People's Republic of China. So I like showing this. So overall, China ranks 78th in doing business in the world. It's in between Panama and Kyrgyzstan, countries which have a 2% growth rate in a very good year. That's not a good year for China. That's a very bad year for China, right? And so, and my favorite, right, is dealing with construction permits is 172nd in the world, but we see with our eyes a lot of construction occurs in China, right? So how does all that happen, right? And why would they invest? And so they, all of that happens because basically they have informal relationships with political elites. The story has been told by many people, not me, much better than me, right? But there's a separate question to that I think is more interesting, which I like to call the Yashang Huang question, where he says basically entrepreneurs were stoned in the streets in the 1960s and 70s as part of the Cultural Revolution, yet a mere 15 years later, they are happy to take extraordinary risks and invest in risky business activity. And why would they do that, right? Why would they do that? And the answer he gives is that they have basically low expectations, like if I can do something and get punished but make a little bit of money, maybe it'll be fine, and that it was directionally liberal. So the signals, not the institutions, but the signals from politics is that their activity would be tolerated and even rewarded, and that was good enough for most Chinese people who are really risk accepting. I don't disagree with him, but I would add to that there's a culture and history of adaptation that informed how they made those decisions over time that becomes really relevant to how we think about state-business relations all the way up to today. So I'm going to say this really obvious thing. So Rong Yiren, does anyone know who Rong Yiren is? Yeah, most Chinese people know who Rong Yiren is. So very interesting person. I looked at a lot of his family's memoirs. Many people have, right? But his family was like a huge business family in Shanghai, cotton magnates. Most of his family fled during the revolution. He stayed behind. He became what was called a red capitalist in China. In the 1950s, he went abroad and sold the communist dream to other countries. Oh, I'm a capitalist. I'm doing very well. He basically takes all of his skills. He's one of the only people who understands double entry bookkeeping in China in the 50s. And so a lot of these entrepreneurs did that where they were like, okay, well, let me teach the regime how to read a balance sheet, right? And so they're doing all this stuff in the 1950s. He was a red capitalist, a heart of the regime, showcasing that the CCP would be friendly to capitalists. And it was actually in the first few years of the 1950s, partly because they had dual missions of revolution, but national rehabilitation. And so, in fact, the revolution in economic terms of nationalization and socialization was remarkably gradual in China in ways that kind of taught these people who, should have been, by virtue of communist theory, victims of the immediate revolution, how to slowly adapt their behavior such that by 56 and 57, most of them are selling over their plants and firms at really low rates because they just want it to be over with and they don't want to be punished, right? And so, so all of this happens very slowly. What happened to Rong Yiren in the Cultural Revolution is that he gets stoned in the street, right, is forced to be a janitor for several years. And in fact, he is punished in multiple campaigns over and over again and keeps coming back, right, to say, and why does he do that, right? Not necessarily because he trusts the regime, right? He doesn't expect it to return cooperation, but he's trying to protect himself the entire time. And you see this over and over and over again, right? So I talk about this culture of adaptation. Those of you who are interested in how campaigns work in China should read Professor Looney's book, which is like the definitive statement of how campaigns work. But campaigns is basically the technology of politics in China. You've all seen them. Zero COVID, that was a campaign. Belt and Road is a campaign. Made in China 2025, also a campaign. Zero Poverty is a campaign. But so was the Great Leap Forward. So was the socialist education movement. In fact, our graduate school seminar on China was basically organized week by campaigns, and we had to read 2 books in Chinese and 1 in English every week. So if it sounds like a lot to read 1 book, that was what we had to do. But in any case, right, and campaigns are fundamentally unpredictable, right? Except for they tend to follow a similar cycle where they're going to hit these different points of the cycle, which is propaganda linking the campaign's success to the goals of the revolution, work teams sent down, mass mobilization. Then you have all of this frenzied scurrying on the part of Chinese citizens who are quite smart to try to align what they're doing with the campaign, whether they really are or not, right? In order to, as Michael Oxenberg famously said, get along and get ahead in communist China. And then you have a waves of excessive activity followed by recalibration, right? And so during these campaigns, you habituate over and over again to try to listen to the wind or smell the wind and adapt, right, is the way that the phrases go in Chinese, and figure out how to repeat the language of campaigns and find a way to couch what you're doing in that language in order to adapt. And that's exactly really what Chinese entrepreneurs did in the reform era in different ways, which I'll show you. But let me make an argument for which I have no data in the book to confirm, and I do not try to sustain in the book, but I think is interesting, and especially for people who are interested in research on China, is one that maybe perhaps more creative people than me can solve. But it's very interesting when you talk to people who do business in and with China. Is it competitive? It's like fiercely competitive, right? Why are they so good at figuring out what global supply chains and global value chains need? So good at anticipating the next thing? And I think a lot of it is they're habituated to do this in the politics of the regime. They're quick to adapt, to get that information, to pivot their behavior. It's the same thing in keeping your ear to the ground with new processes of manufacturing and new demand and global supply chains. And so anyway, there's no substantiation of that, but I think it's interesting. Okay, so what do I mean by this culture of adaptation in China? Here's some basic adaptations of that, right? So in the early 1980s, what's called in Chinese, 戴红帽子, they wear the red hat. They pretend to be town and village enterprises because privately owned enterprises are not legal. So they just register themselves as something different, continue to do business, take some risks, but try to understand you have to pretend to be something you're not. In the 1990s, China experienced enormous FDI round-tripping, whereby you have people in mostly coastal southern China sending their FDI out of the country and then back into the country in order to get benefits for foreign investors that were both tax and all the kinds of financial incentives, but also to protect themselves as foreign capital, which was preferred at the time, right? They joined formal institutions, as many people's work has shown. A lot of people read that as them having trust in the regime or political connections. I don't see how we know that from that behavior because, if you join the faculty senate, is that because you trust the dean, or is that because you want to know what's going on? Harvard has no faculty senate or faculty good judgment, or governance at all. So I can't join any such institution. But in any case, right, they join for protection and for information. But you also have other kinds of, seeking out political protectors. I tell the story in the book of this one guy I met who has a high-tech business in a development zone, and I'm like, how is this high-tech? He's like, it's not. I just call it high-tech. And I know how to call it high-tech because I called it FDI in the 90s, and so basically, and now it's like, it's, science and technology or microelectronics. Like, they know how to name their things in time, right, to figure out how to get along and get ahead in the context of campaigns, and they adapt, and they do so. The important thing is that's mostly because they don't expect the returned cooperation of the regime in general. And so they're constantly scurrying to do different things, even in the context of taking those risks. And the scurrying and doing different things to protect themselves, I argue, has consequences. So I call this in the book adept dissimulation, which is a term I take from the 1960s literature on campaigns in China. And it has a number of different manifestations at the institutional level, right? They join the CCP or run for office. At the firm level, we find them disguising their firm type, right? They parrot official language. They have short time horizons, which is a huge part of the argument that I make. And they engage in asset expatriation or capital flight, which is a manifestation of mutual endangerment that I'll get to. And privately, they engage in vice, which is very interesting, right? So there's a great book on this by John Osberg, an anthropologist who writes a book about basically why do entrepreneurs go to KTVs and do all kinds of things with political elites. And it's like, well, you get them, to do something above board with you, it's good, but to get them to do something incriminating is even better. And they're not actually necessarily trying to get resources from these people, but just some kind of protection. And they engage in these activities that they are allowed to by the institutions that are basically accumulating personal wealth over long-term health of the firm. Okay, so how do you get mutual endangerment? I argue you have to have this endemic distrust, but you also have to have the actual tools that allow businesses to do things, right, that endanger business people. And financial liberalization is a huge part of that. And I will explain it in a little bit. But the manifestation, how do you know you're in mutual endangerment? I argue there are three manifestations. You get the weaponization of information. It's usually called compromat, right? So trying to invest in getting compromising information on either party. It's hard to observe systematically, by the way, because it's intended to not be observed systematically, so that's very difficult. You have asset expatriation. So the widespread use of, investing abroad in order to get your capital out to both hedge against an eventuality, but also protect yourself and your person. And you have this looting behavior. But let me just give two kind of conceptual caveats before I go forward. Fundamentally, what I'm describing is a conception of the moral economy. So everyone's kind of expectations of doing business and how things work in a certain place. It is not meant to describe all of the behaviors of all of the people, and it's under all systems, right, or under all circumstances. So it's not like this deterministic thing, right? What I argue is that if there are enough people behaving this way, then it changes everyone else's expectations about how to behave, and it becomes sufficiently pervasive to have real economic and political consequences. But it's not as if I expect every official to behave in a certain way just because they're able to, or every business person to behave in a certain way just because they're able to. The last thing is, it's really different from patronage and clientelism, mutual endangerment. So patronage, it's like, and you have all these studies in political science and in economics that are like, oh, let's identify the patrons, the political patrons of these businesses, and when those patrons fall, how much asset value do they lose, either in market cap or contracts or something like that. Yeah, we know political connections matter, right? But what I observe, right, and a bunch of qualitative interviews, as well as like you see, how people are scurrying around, especially during the anti-corruption campaign in China, it's not as if firms have a single political patron. In fact, you find them behind the scenes invested in a bunch of different political families and political factions. I don't measure political factions. I'm not one of those people. But they're really, really diversified in their political portfolio. And so in a really interesting way, it's like a web rather than a hierarchy of interactions where we can measure the effects of political corruption and political favoritism in different ways. And that's an important, I think, conceptual distinction, because I have a bit of trouble methodologically with the papers that purport to show all of these things about these events, because you can't say just because, this firm didn't lose value, they may have another, just because Boise Lai fell, they may have another person in power that's allowing them to be protected. In fact, that's how many people in China talk about why they cultivate those relationships. And so I just don't see the political science concepts as well enough descriptive of the empirical things I observe in China and frankly in Indonesia at this time. Let me say just a few things about Indonesia and then a few things about China. So Indonesia, very clear case of mutual alignment and very tight control over the financial sector within the country, right? So why couldn't Indonesian business people loot their firms, engage in all kinds of things, asset expatriation? Mostly because they did asset expatriation, actually, throughout the Suharto period, right? But they weren't looting their own firms and manipulating the financial system, partly because the financial system wasn't open to them. They weren't able to do it. It was basically state-owned banks under Suharto. And Suharto was stuck, yes, in the pathology of mutual alignment, which is developmental paradox. So it was basically reliant on a few industries. And then you hit oil shocks of the 1980s, which basically teach the leadership in Indonesia they can't rely on resource rents anymore, nor can they really rely on international rents, especially after the end of the Cold War. To fund what they wanted to do. So then they say basically we need financial liberalization. We need to liberalize, liberate private capital, allocate resources and do things, right? And so they do that. This Pacto 88 allows private firms to establish banks in Indonesia. They establish a stock market exchange and encourage private firms to start listing on the stock market exchange, right? And they do. So the number of state banks stays the same. Private banks basically explodes during this period. The rate of credit growth is astonishing. Foreigners are like, yeah, I'm interested in Indonesia, but not that interested, right? So they come in a more limited way during certain periods, right? But you get this huge explosion in credit growth and a huge explosion in the private ownership of capital institutions in Indonesia, which allows them to do all kinds of things. So you have this explosion of trading on the Jakarta Stock Exchange, explosion in listing. You also have all kinds of things, people describing it as a casino or a rodeo of the stock exchange. People are issuing literally fake stock certificates on the floor that are like counterfeit in all different ways. And you have all kinds of companies listing on stock exchanges and having banks and hiding their ownership of either of those things, trying to get as much as they can out of this financial system while they think the getting is good during this time period. What's super interesting here, so I did a lot of work in corporate filings in all three countries, looking really deeply at like who was engaged with who in shareholding of different projects and and co-investment in different projects, and as well as lending, which you'll see in the Chinese case. So what's so interesting is this is like the 300 largest conglomerates in Indonesia at the time. And the biggest ones are all tied to one another. This is just an expanded view of that. They're co-invested in one another in really interesting ways. And so just briefly, for those of you interested in like Korea and Japan, this is not how the chaebol and the keiretsu work. They are super tightly integrated and deeply competitive with each other. You would never find them co-invested with one another, right? And why are they doing this? They're all buying into this kind of web of activity in a way that makes them all much safer over time. Okay, so then you have basically the Asian financial crisis. And what happens during the Asian financial crisis, I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, the book does in probably way too much detail, is that you have an exogenous, in a way, challenge. So first of all, you have enormous corporate debt on Indonesian balance sheets, right? Why were they indebting themselves so much? Well, partly because they were taking that money and turning it into assets abroad, right? And they had the expectation they'd be bailed out and they didn't really care, right? Or that they'd be expropriated. Either one, they didn't have a trust in the future in either direction, and the behavior is kind of the same. I won't go into the economics of that. There's a very famous paper on bankruptcy for profit, and I argue the same thing works when you expect expropriation, but I won't go into that. And so then basically there's a short-term challenge to Suharto in terms of the exogenous shock of the Asian financial crisis, which is kind of exogenous, but also a lot of the activities that Indonesian conglomerates were undertaking are part of that. And they all move their money out so fast, it causes the rupiah to plummet even further. And so there's this super interesting history whereby the Suharto family was begging all of the Chinese elites to bring their assets back to prop up the value of the rupiah. And they were basically saying, yeah, we'll do that. But the entire time getting all of their assets out because they were afraid even more. Moreover, the crisis lasted a long time in Indonesia. It's not like a crisis hit and he was out within 4 days. It was like a year and a half, basically. And what ends up happening during that time period is they set up what looks like, do you remember the TARP from the global financial crisis? So Obama administration set up, well, let's bail out some of the banks and rescue some of the assets. So it was very similar this reconstruction bank in Indonesia. And all of these guys who are close to Suharto at that time are taking the largest amounts of bailout funds and immediately funneling it abroad, right? And so they're doing all kinds of things, looting their own firms. Their own firms are going under hugely, right? And they're doing all of this because they just don't expect the future to make any sense for them and to be a welcome place for them. And therefore, they accelerate these exact dynamics that bring Suharto down. All right, so let's go back to China. I want to leave time for Q&A, so I don't want to get too detailed into this. And, but this kind of answer to that first question, how have they sustained growth with bad institutions? I think the informal arrangements explain it, okay? That's like step one. But then, what's really interesting is you have corruption in a lot of places. Whenever I name a corrupt country in class, I get in trouble. So there's corruption in lots of places, okay? I'm not gonna name a specific country. But the corruption in China existed alongside extraordinary economic growth. And in fact, the creation of productive private sector firms alongside unproductive public sector firms. So why are the private sector firms so productive? And why does you could easily imagine a corruption that's unproductive, but in China it's super productive. And the argument that I make is that the financial sector was disciplined in two different ways at this time. First, the private sector was excluded from bank lending and finance in China, which most scholars have said that's the problem. All of the capital went to the state-owned sector, and they misused it. If it had gone to the private sector, it would have been more efficiently allocated. Maybe. But also, it meant that the private sector had to be extraordinarily competitive because they had to invest based on either foreign capital or retained earnings. So they were super disciplined, okay? And then why do you get local politicians who want to encourage economic growth? And that's the fiscal discipline part of it. That their fiscal resources for the first couple decades of reform came from taxes generated by productive activity in their jurisdiction. So they only get money if their firms are actually doing well, right? Later, it becomes really different because they get money from land. And once the private sector does get limited access, access, but not governed by liberalized interest rates and credit sharing, you start to get massive looting in the financial sector and investments that are totally unproductive. So let me talk a little bit about that. So the primary goal of everyone was generating economic activity and getting rich, right? The cadre evaluation system, about which everyone in the Chinese politics field knows way too much, plus the fiscal policies were generating the right incentives. So you get promoted or you get bonuses based on GDP growth or taxes, and you retain those taxes to do what you want. Businesses investing using retained earnings. Again, that's the conventional wisdom. My argument is that exclusion produced the hard budget constraints, which made them incredibly scrappy and incredibly productive from the very beginning. Okay. So over the 2000s and really the late 1990s, that discipline attenuates in both the financial and fiscal systems. Political scientists or economists who want a moment of shock that creates a change will not find one in my book, okay? So what happens over time is that there's a huge change in the fiscal system. You get the rise of land finance, which I've written another book about, and the re-centralization of tax revenue. What does that look like here, in case you all don't know this, right? So this is 1994. So basically, when the reforms start, the central share of total revenues and expenditures is going down, meaning local governments are responsible for more expenditures, but they're getting more of the share of the revenue, the tax revenue. Until 1994, when the center re-centralizes revenues, but doesn't re-centralize expenditures, which means local governments are still responsible for spending on everything from public services, social welfare provision, et cetera, but they have no tax revenue, and they have actually very few sources of discretionary revenue except for land. Land ends up being like a huge part of what they do. We all know that story. I think at this point I don't want to tell it. But the point is really interesting, which is that if you sell land leases, you get a lot of revenue. A company gets a loan from a bank to invest in a real estate project. That investment goes into GDP, and GDP goes up. No one cares if the investment ends up making money. No one cares. The company that gets a loan from the bank isn't disciplined very much. The bank doesn't much care. They're not allocating capital in a way for which they will be held accountable. The people who introduce the bank and the firm and the officials, which are sometimes called the jieshaoren in Chinese, they get a kickback. The larger the investment is, the more it bumps GDP. No one's thinking in the very long term because everyone's expecting to be cycled out of their official position or to enter a different industry in a little while, right? And in the financial system, right, you get this partial liberalization of banks and of stock markets in China, an edifice of a modern system that looks like corporate governance and shareholder minority protection, et cetera, with none of the actual transparency and none of the interest rate liberalization, none of the actual minority shareholding protections that makes companies that list on exchanges ideally behave well, right? And so bureaucrats at this point in the financial sector are supposed to replace the party as in monitoring firms, right? But they fail to do this for a variety of reasons that are kind of obvious, right? Given that the China's formal institutions are not good for this. I'm not going to go through all of this, but over the 2000s, you get this rise of shadow banking, local government financing platforms, all kinds of financial alchemy going on in the Chinese banking and corporate governance and corporate finance system that's allowing a lot of money beyond the sight of the state to be cycled back and forth in ways that are super financially risky for the entire system, but also for the entrepreneurs who are engaged in this, right? Things didn't go well for Su Jiayin or H&A or Wanda Group or any of these companies, right, that are engaged in all these different things. Here are some quotes. The first one's not from me. It's from the book Red Roulette by Desmond Shum. Who says basically you can't, it's about the time horizon question, right? Why would I build something for a long period of time? Just take the money that's on the table. You don't know when the policies are going to change. The second quote is also about kind of self-enrichment and the short term, right? And the last one is one of my favorites. It's from a major bank in China, a private bank, one of the only private banks in China. I began to wonder after working for several years, what's the point of trying to build the asset portfolio with proper understandings of risk and return? My colleagues were taking cuts of whatever, and my boss expected me to do whatever. And so I wanted to survive, and it was like a joke to pretend like any of us cared about the bank's balance sheet. And that's really the moral economy argument. This guy didn't go into things expecting to become basically a member in a mafia business system, but he was impressed into being it because what else can you be, right? So you get asset expatriation, weaponized information, and looting. I'm going to go through these quickly. So asset expatriation, I've already shown how this works. Let me show you another version of that. For all the books on is China buying Latin America, is China buying Africa, actually the bulk of Chinese foreign direct investment went to the United States and Europe, especially after the kickoff of Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign. Why is it that you have companies like H&A, and Anbang buying the Waldorf Astoria and the Fosun bought Club Med, Su Jiayin buying football teams. What was yours? Oh, yeah, Wanda. Well, they're at least in the film business, but yes, they did that, right? And a lot of that is because, and it's very interesting because at this time, they're overpaying for a lot of these assets. And some of the assets are in strategic sectors and some are not. And some, now I do work much more on technology stuff, whatever, but people in the US government say, that's national security premium. And I'm like, but whose national security? So sometimes the national security premium is when Chinese consortia overpay for high-tech assets. But the personal security premium is when Chinese entrepreneurs overpay for real estate in Vancouver. So anyway, that's the price of turning the renminbi into US dollars or Canadian dollars. Weaponized information. This is the hardest part of the book because it's really hard to show how this works, but I said I would say something about the time of Xiao Jianhua. So why is it, first of all, why did he know to flee to Hong Kong? Why did he stay in Hong Kong for 3 years with no consequences? And why did it take 5 years to actually charge him? And all of this, I would say, has to do with what he knew about other people and Xi Jinping trying to outmaneuver. So why are some people catch and release and other people not? It's all about what power you hold and what you know. So Guo and Gui, and I really love these dynamics. I wish there were a way to study them more systematically. Maybe you can be more creative than me. But Guo and Gui is super interesting. For those of you who know, who have listened to his corruption stories. So everyone tells me he does this strategic thing, which is tells stories that are super true about the wrong people, right? And then he tells stories that are false alongside stories that are true, which is all just him signaling, I know things I could tell and I'm not telling them but you better like do something for me to not tell you, right? And so, why did it take so long for Xiao Jianhua? Well, someone tipped him off. Why would they tip him off? They don't want him exposing them. Why does it take so long? He had to maneuver out people who were implicated in Xiao Jianhua's thing. Why did it take 5 years? Same reason. But can I prove that? No. All right. So, and the last is looting. Luckin Coffee. How many of you have had a Luckin Coffee? Okay, pretty good actually. Still there. So Luckin Coffee is part of this business group, and they've done this 3 times. They did it with rental cars. They did it with, what was the other one? Rental cars? I'll figure it out. But they've done it. It's in the book. They've done it with 3 different sectors. Rental cars, where they find a sector. They go super fast to IPO. They cook all the books in terms of their revenue projections. And then they hoover up the money in the IPO and pledge it towards something else, right? In Luckin, they probably accidentally came across a pretty good business model, but when they relaunched in China, they were saying we stole foreigners' money and we're so great, which was like really interesting. But in any case, H&A is another example of that. Hainan Hong Kong, some of you, I've flown on their planes. It was fine. But like basically, so the research that I was looking at, I think I have a table on this a little bit later, but this Luckin thing is not unusual. Like a lot of Chinese companies are doing that in China and outside of China, rushing to IPO, collecting as much money as they can, right? Absconding with some of that money. And that's bizarre behavior, right? And you might say, well, it's only possible because China doesn't have an SEC that's actually investigating these companies, but they do kind of have that, right? But also within the US, right, and within other systems, there aren't incentives for people to do that, whereas it's really a short time horizon thing in China because that's based on this distrust as well as the access to the financial sector that allows them to do that. So here's what I find really interesting. So I did a lot of work with the corporate filings and with the bond prospectuses. So this is an incomplete map of where Wanda and H&A, so Hainan Hong Kong and Dalian Wanda, where they got loans. So what's interesting is how dispersed it is, right? The same thing is true for Evergrande, although I don't have it up here, right? So they're taking loans from like scores and scores of local private banks and financial institutions, right? And many of those banks don't necessarily know how much they're owing to other banks, right? So it's almost like an extreme kind of gambling situation, right? And taking a lot of this money and then investing it abroad or lying about it on their balance sheets, et cetera. So here's just like a little shot of some of the work I was able to do. So the subsidiaries of these different conglomerates, right? Why would H&A have over 1,000 subsidiaries? This is incomplete, by the way. There's no way I have all of these. At 11 levels of ownership. So just for the record, like in Israel, there's no more than 2 levels of ownership allowed. Whereas I'm going like 11 level, who owns that, 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 to figure out that it's actually an H&A company. Why does an airline company have 139 financial firms, 13 listed vehicles, 400 business services listed, these are all kind of financial intermediation firms. And then I find the ICIJ appearances in different ways. And so anyway, so this is the kind of the evidence of extreme financial malfeasance and looting that's permitted by the liberalization of the financial sector. Okay, so just a couple of conclusions. The argument that the way I would like people in the field to think about state-business relations in authoritarian regimes is they're inherently unstable. So I think we go very quickly to saying this is how things work and this is how it's stable without recognizing that there's some drama to be explained and that there's some unstable equilibria. And that's what I argue that both of these are. Mutual alignment causes stagnation, which makes you want to break out of that stagnation by doing things that upset those vested interests. And mutual endangerment is inherently dramatic because I don't trust the other side and I'm constantly trying to protect myself in ways that can be destabilizing. I'm not going to go too much into the financial control, but what's really interesting in China now, and is that China now is looking a little bit like Malaysia. So how Malaysia has solved this problem of it gets competitive clientelism whenever it liberalizes the financial sector is having extensive corporate shareholding on the part of UMNO itself. And so China is now doing the same thing, right? extreme capital controls, the rise of state shareholding, the reorganization of financial regulation, and campaigns to put the party as the monitor within firms. Doesn't mean they're doing a good job, doesn't mean they're controlling firms, but the party is there. And many people say, like, oh, that's the party, controlling firms. And I'm like, actually, I think that's evidence that the party doesn't control the firms. But anyway, and I don't mean party cells. I'm not interested in party cells. We have no evidence those do anything other than govern the party. I'm not interested in that. What I mean is the party is a minority shareholder in the private sector, and now is a minority shareholder for over half of listed firms in China, maybe more. Okay. So this is basically my last slide. So I love this quote from Levitt and March about how organizations work, right? So they learn over time to behave in certain ways, and that comes from history. It comes from their learned expectations of reciprocity and vulnerability. It's hard to break. So people often ask me, now that Xi Jinping is back out saying we need the entrepreneurs, what do you think about that? Well, that's what I think about that. And that basically we should think about moral economies more frequently of capitalism and authoritarianism, generalized practices about how things work that once you understand them are possible to measure. That business has a disruptive power. It doesn't need to be democratic in order to be democratizing on accident eventually, or at least destabilizing. And that there are limits to technocracy. So the most interesting thing to me was reading all of the literature that came out of the IMF, the World Bank, various advisors in the 90s about how Suharto was setting up a financial liberal system under the hard work of technocrats that would figure out how to regulate everything. And that it's almost like a technical problem of getting the right regulation. It sounds a lot like China right now. We're just going to figure out how to regulate the financial sector. But actually, it's fundamentally very political. And if people don't trust the future, that their physical person and their family will be safe, they're always going to behave in ways that make it really hard to regulate. And if you're not open to political competition, and most importantly, treating the firms that are owned by the state in the same way that firms that are not owned by the state, it's really hard to have technocratic solutions. And therefore, the argument, the provocation, I showed how China's formal institutions have been bad, yet it grew. It grew because informal, you can solve the problems of industrialization and investment through informal arrangements. But now China wants to generate a consumption-driven economy and an innovation-driven economy. And I save like 16% of my income. That's really high for Americans, right? Chinese people save 50% of their income. Right? Why do I only save 16%? Because I trust the financial sector to intermediate that for me and make it look like I was saving a lot more. And in China, to have consumption-driven economy, that means I spend more of my income, right? So in order to have a consumption-driven economy, you have to have a financial sector that allows people to trust the future and stop saving so much. And innovation requires efficient capital allocation, at least some of it. And having a financial sector may not work with China's political institutions. It's a question to ask yourself. Thank you so much for paying attention.
Thanks for this super thought-provoking talk, and especially with a lot of details with the cases, a lot of insights. In fact, it really made me to rethink a lot of assumptions we have about Chinese political economy. Okay, we still have like 15 minutes left, so let's open the floor, and can someone raise your hand? And you get to pick who.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. I have a question. I think that's very interesting to see you compare China and Malaysia and Indonesia. I want to know your opinion about Singapore. Singapore has a very strong influence about Malaysia and Indonesia. Actually, I work with a global company. Mm-hmm. Actually, I also met Guo Guangchang because I used to work with the Prudential.
Yeah.
Guo Guangchang is our joint venture partner in China. And we set up the business in Malaysia and Indonesia. I remembered very clearly our joint venture partner in Indonesia. He literally told us all of his family members are in Singapore. His wife, his kids, everybody in Singapore. Only himself in Indonesia.
Yeah, pretty normal.
And also now, a lot of the Chinese business people also set up the entities, also go to the Singapore. And how do you think of the Singapore positions in this kind of situation?
Well, Singapore played a role, right, of a destination for those capital and people for safety. It was super interesting. I was doing fieldwork in Indonesia in the fall of 2016 during these Ahok riots, if anyone remembers this. So the governor of Java, who was ethnically Chinese, so it was super unusual, had made some remarks about the Quran, and people were really upset. And Chinese friends of mine had plane tickets every day, just in case the riots got really bad, they would have to leave. So they had just like standing reservations on planes, and I thought that was really interesting. So yeah, Singapore has a role. I thought you were gonna ask me a different question, which is like, doesn't Singapore have an advanced modern financial sector without political control? And to which my answer is like, maybe, but Singapore has 5 million people, and it's a city-state. So I just don't think it's like comparable. Like I just don't think Singapore can be compared. I mean, you know, there's a way in which the discipline comes in Singapore from, they pay the officials like a lot of money. Most places can't do that. And so, I mean, Singapore is this really interesting, I see its whole institutional system is built on collecting the rents of the ambient economic activity around it by developing good institutions. But they don't necessarily have, obviously they have political competition, but it's not open political competition. But I just don't see, I see it as like so exceptional, it's not worth theorizing about, which may sound really dismissive. But yeah, there have to be these entrepôts that, you know, allow, you know, some of the scurrying of capital and the safety of people. Hong Kong has played that role. Singapore has played that role. In like Latin America, I think Miami plays that role, right, for Latin American elites. London plays that role. Paris plays that role, right? There's always somewhere else to go. The Bahamas play that role. The Cayman Islands play that role. So, but yeah, Singapore is an important part of the story in Indonesia and Malaysia in particular. Yes.
Hello, my name's Angela, and I had a question about, you said, you mentioned like the lack of trust in the government when it comes to like financial policies, and do you see sort of a change happening in that? Because I know recently like the CCP passed some policies in I think like late September to like kind of spur consumption or try to increase domestic consumption, including like trying to slow down the fall of housing prices, since a lot of Chinese assets or domestic assets are held in the housing market. Yeah. So is there maybe like increased activity for the CCP to try to instill more confidence in like future expectations of the economy?
There's definitely a lot of action to try to do that. I don't think it's been effective. So in different talks I would have, like, because I give like some presentations on China macro stuff, and like the consumer confidence index is still really low. Like it dropped hugely actually in 2018, and then hugely during the Shanghai lockdown, bumped up just a little bit in the post-COVID, and then has been back down to where it was during the Shanghai lockdown. And so no, I don't think so. And I mean, the argument I make in the book is that, ironically, the CCP wants to solve all of its problems with campaigns, but campaigns are the problem. So like now there's like, you know, campaigns to, you know, like, I mean, my female friends in China are like, what the hell is going on? Like for 40 years, they told me what I could do with my body. Now they're telling me to have more children and stay home. I'm not getting married, you know, forget everything. And so, you know, now a pro-natalist campaign, you know, I don't know if is going to solve those particular things. It's really hard to get people to have babies. Maybe easier to get them to not have babies. But anyway, why am I talking about that? But the point is that I don't see, like, I actually think anything's possible with China, and we should express a lot of humility because their trajectory tends to be nonlinear. So radical things happen and then crazy things happen. But I feel like they are at a point where what they really want is people to stop saving so much money, start spending more money, for capital not to go into inefficient places and go into efficient places, right? And it's all about now behaviors at the household level rather than firms and industries, right? It's not just about marginal incentives anymore. Like for you to put your money in the financial system for retirement, it's not good enough institutions, right? In fact, like they would have been better off in 2015 had they just let the stock market go. And the book has a whole narration of that stock market crisis, if you're interested in reading it. But I basically think they're in a position now where it's really going to be difficult for them to, because what do people want to trust? It's not that they need to trust the system, they need to trust that markets work. And I don't think the average Chinese household trusts that their money is well protected in China's financial markets. And as long as they don't trust that, then they're going to have to save as much as they think they need for retirement and for paying for everything. And that's a lot of money. So I think I think the financial sector part of this of what they want to do next is really, really difficult.
Can I ask a follow-up? Do you think they have to do something radical, like kind of letting people invest in foreign markets? Because I know right now they have like really strict codes on like how much like you can invest in foreign stock markets, and like, do you think that would be necessary?
I think they have to do something more radical than that. But yeah, I would say, yeah. I mean, lifting capital controls, but they have no intention of doing that, none. But yes, but even more radical things. I don't know. Up here, maybe? Do we have time for a couple more, or should I get a couple more and then answer? Okay.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm a second-year Asian Studies student focusing on political economy. My question is, what do you think of the increased usage of a digital renminbi? It would help with consumption-led growth, kind of like UBI, as well as helping to just like with all the capital outflows out of China, it might help track, because the PBOC can just like see where the money supply is going, which can help with the corruption issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. So the question is about the digital renminbi. Will that help the government track what's going on? Yeah, I think it will. I don't know that I have too much to add about that, but yeah, I think that's right.
That's why people like Bitcoin, right? To move the money off.
Yeah. My only rule of giving a talk in public is to not talk about Bitcoin. So, because I don't know how that works, I don't understand it. But yeah, people are buying Bitcoin. Professor Liu's right, but that's probably why. But I don't know how that works.
Since most Chinese people use WeChat Pay,
Yeah.
it's like really simple chunks like fees.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't think the rest of the world is going to take that up in any way, and so I do have papers on like renminbi internationalization that I'm working on, and the U.S. hysteria that the renminbi is going to replace the dollar, and I'm like, no, and I don't even think the People's Bank of China and the monetary authorities in any way have those ambitions. Even they've lowered their ambitions from what they had a few years ago, partly in response to, like, they thought they could liberalize capital flows and feel fine with it, but then the reimposition of capital controls in 2016, 2017 sort of taught them that they're super scared of this, and they've recalibrated their expectations and their ambitions for things. And so yeah, I mean, I think it'll be really interesting for people to do research on how that changes behavior of firms. I mean, it's really the ways in which firms expatriate their assets and engage in international asset expatriation is super interesting. Like, it's mostly done through transfer pricing, which is a really fascinating way of doing things. And so, whether that's trackable or not is also really interesting. And what you find is, like, basically, like, companies like Wanda, right, and Fosun ended up, like, using collateral in China to borrow from European banks to finance their expansion, in a way that actually made it difficult for the authorities in Beijing to seize that collateral, because it would have created a lot of problems with their relationship with those European banks and economies. So that was very smart of them, but not necessarily economically, just like politically. But anyway, how that will work is up to you. I hope you do research on that. I don't know. Yeah.
So I was just wondering if you could discuss more about kind of the underlying assumption of that it was one of the questions at the beginning of the talk about the link between democracy and capitalism and democratization, because a lot of historical lessons from the 20th century and like modern America to me seem that link is not necessarily like guaranteed. So I was just, can you kind of talk about that? I was just curious.
There are a lot of questions about capitalism and democracy that I don't have any business answering, right? And so the question of, is capitalism democratic? I can't answer that, right? Is democracy, like, does capitalism undermine democracy? Like, I can't answer. I just don't have the ability to answer any of those questions. What I think is interesting is that we tend to, like, the last part of the book, right, has this phrase, which is like, it's kind of weird to end a book that's ultimately about fraud and malfeasance with a cry for political rights for capitalists. But basically, if people are secure in, bankruptcy is not going to lead to their imprisonment and their political disenfranchisement or the murder of their family, they behave in more regular ways, right? They behave as if they have a stake in a system that they do. That doesn't mean they always get it right? Steve Cohen's always out there doing something, right? We can always, Bernie Madoff does something. Like, we can point to bad people stealing money all the time in other regimes. But it does seem to me like political rights, and I really mean like civil rights in a weird way, like protection from unlawful detention, expropriation, and harm by the state, does tend to affect the time horizons of business in a way that I think makes a big difference. I mean, people have been making that argument about property rights for a long period of time. But I guess what I'd like to say also is that personal rights, and you may just call that another form of property right. Do I have a property right over my body not being murdered? Okay, that's fine. But like, there's something about that because you can give, well, I guess that's the big argument. I don't know that you can give property rights over business property in an authoritarian regime and have it be secure. But my argument is that there's something about political inclusion, transparency, rights as claims against the state that will be respected by an independent judiciary. Those things tend to go with democracy and open political competition that does change the time horizons of entrepreneurs. Is what I'm saying the most profoundly original thing anyone's ever said? Not at all. It's like the old justification for democracy. And so it's not like I think I've invented the concept of time horizons and rights for people. I just think it's worth saying, and when we most likely are to call right now autocratic regimes crony and resilient. In fact, I don't think they are. I don't think crony is enough, and I don't think they're resilient.
So we only have time for one last
question, I guess. Stephen?
So a lot of stories about highly financialized or leveraged economies invoke stories about bailouts. But I thought part of what you were telling today was you never mentioned anything about moral hazard.
Yeah.
I was wondering what role that kind of plays in your story at all.
That's a great question. So it does play a role. So you probably know the bankruptcy for profit literature, like the old Akerlof paper, right? So the paper is like, why would you get firms? And the examples come from Chile and the US savings and loan crisis, which is basically, I expect a bailout and therefore I'm gonna indebt my firm so that I can get that bailout because it's better than trying to manage the assets that I have in a crisis, right? So I argue that, yeah, that's true. Like, I think that's true, right? And so a lot of, and there's a way in which it affects behavior, which is, and that there's some quotes in the book to this effect and some evidence of it. Like, in fact, ask yourself, like, why would Evergrande give $100 million to Harvard during the crisis? I'm becoming too big to fail. Like, I'm becoming so big that you have to help me because it's embarrassing to you if I fail, right? So it's a gamble for resurrection in economics terms in an interesting way. So that's part of the moral hazard. But the other part of it is not quite moral hazard. It's that if you expect expropriation, you actually behave in the same way. So the behavior, like in terms of how I think the incentives work, if you expect to be bailed out or expropriated, either way you get short term and you drive short term benefits. And so you might as well be too big to fail, or you might as well ingratiate yourself. And then worst case scenario is like the government takes your business, well, at least your kids and some of your assets are overseas. And then you protect yourself against your physical lack of safety by having nasty information on someone else. And so there's no game theory in the book, but like I've been informed in my thinking about a lot of that stuff. I don't draw the medals as well as other people. And so, but yeah, I think that expropriation works in the same way. But thanks. It's a good question. Thank you all for joining me on a beautiful Friday. You should be outside doing something nice.